And as you've already mentioned, really interested in playfulness, in games, and in creativity. I'm going to go into that a little bit more and tell you where that interest comes from. But if you wouldn't mind moving the slide on. Just to start off with, I'm interested to know, is anybody in the room happy to share? What are your experience of using games, creativity, or playful activities in your practice? If the answer is you've got no experience, that's absolutely fine. Just looking to understand where you're at. Yeah, absolutely. And as you'll see, as I go further on, that's something I actually talk about. So yeah, that's great.
Right.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to carry on, and I'm going to hopefully leave some space at the end, and hopefully some more people will be happy to share. But it's great hearing your examples. Thank you. If you wouldn't mind moving the slide on. So I said I'd mention where my interest started. As probably won't be surprising, it was a little bit unconventional for me. So I worked in a job as an administrator and became an auntie, and I actually have a nephew who's neurodiverse, and I very quickly became aware that he was going to go into a schooling system that wouldn't necessarily support him in a way that meant that he could learn well. And what actually happened was that he got really interested in games, and that led me to look at games and think, well, is there something here I can learn that I can use to essentially help him learn? And what that did for me was it opened up a complete different world of inclusivity, and a way of teaching that was a bit unconventional, but it actually means that you can cater more for a diverse group of learners. And that's where my interest was piqued, really, and it kind of went on from there. So the things that I sort of describe as combining is creativity, because thinking on your feet and being used to chaos and quite happy to sort of plan things but not necessarily be worried when they don't go the way that you plan, I think is really key. Playful learning, so things like you've been talking about already, so giving opportunities for failure and then teaching people how they deal with failure, adding in elements of surprise, of humour, you know, a couple of zombies, a few pirates if we can manage it, and a bit of mystery as well. And then the other thing that I talk about is game-informed learning. Now, the reason I talk about this and the way this differs from gamification and from serious games and game-based learning, essentially what I do is I'm inspired by video games and elements from video games, and I try and basically put them into practice. So what I mean by that is things like narrative and like role playing and creating safe spaces for failure. So it's those elements of video games that really lend themselves well to teaching practices like active learning. And this is the bit where it kind of crosses over from your video game that's really engaging to like working with something that you can actually help people teach from. So if you want to move on a slide. So how I make this happen. So the first thing I do is a magpie. So what I mean by this is that I find shiny things. I allow myself to be inspired. I play lots of video games. I get plenty involved with silly things and comedy and humour and all of those things. And I try and understand the types of things that will help learners. And then I borrow them and I see how I can apply them to a teaching context. Then I find some tools that are going to help me. So this is kind of where tools like OneNote come into it. So the things I tend to look for when I'm looking at digital tools especially is something that is accessible across platforms, preferably something that's got some decent accessibility features, because I've already talked about inclusivity. Things that are free or are included within like an education package. So anything from Microsoft tends to fit this. So that's why I'm going to talk about OneNote a little bit, because that's really useful. But things like Google as well are great. And then the last thing I do is I be a bit creative and I try and figure out how those things I've magpied or borrowed from someone else and the tool that I've found that might actually help me do it, And then I try and be a little bit creative and think, how is this actually going to work together? So this is what led me to escape rooms, if you wouldn't mind changing the slide. So Jim's already described escape rooms earlier on. So a physical escape room, essentially you get locked in a room and you have to figure out how to get out of it. Now, these are actually inspired by video games, which probably explains why I'm interested in it. So they can be quite versatile as active pedagogies as well. So it gives learners the ability to take a role in their learning process and actively construct understanding while engaging in playful problem solving. So this is kind of where OneNote comes in. And am I right in thinking that you guys use Canvas? I think I heard you mention that. So basically, anything that has adaptive release or anything that you can password protect, you can make into an escape room, which is something that I find really enjoyable because I like making everything into an escape room. I did an escape room Easter egg hunt for my nieces and nephew this year because why not? I am getting a bit of a reputation though because I quite often lock myself in them by mistake and then have to figure out a way to get out, which is not something I'd recommend doing. But escape rooms essentially it's an activity where you give somebody a task to do, you give them a password that they have to figure out or an answer that they have to figure out, and that answer leads them into another task. And you can make these as complicated or as simple as possible. And like I mentioned before about surprise and humour and creativity, you can add all of these things in, and you can also make a really effective escape room by using a narrative, so like a storyline that goes all the way through it, and that will help your learner to be drawn through it. You can give them different roles to take on. So I've had a group at one point where everybody in the group thought they were working together, but I'd stuck a mole in there. So I'd had a word with a student beforehand and said, you need to be really disruptive. And we used that as a point to reflect afterwards on how that experience was, having somebody who was constantly trying to put them off, even though they were under a time pressure because they only had a certain amount of time to complete the activity. So you can make these into really useful learning points as well. And like I say, tools like OneNote are fantastic because it's included in your Microsoft package, works across devices, really, really simple to set up. And it's something that students find easy to access and easy to follow. And I have tried a few different platforms, and that's the one that you really don't have to give any explanation with. They kind of just get it intuitively. So that's escape rooms very quickly. If you wouldn't mind moving on slide. So the next thing is choose your own adventures, which is something that you've mentioned. So this kind of comes from, there used to be books that you could read and you'd get to a certain page and then it'd go, like, if you want to make this decision, jump to this page. And this is kind of where the interest came, that and adventure games, because that's another thing that I'm really interested in. I love a good adventure, not too big of a fan on competition. So you'll find me playing adventure games most likely. So choose your own adventures are another great way of delivering learning because you can give students the opportunity to be part of their decision-making process, which means that they're affecting the game essentially by their decisions. Things like Microsoft Forms are fantastic for this. So again, another Microsoft thing. So you've got access to it as a student, and it's part of the Microsoft package. And it's really simple to build something, again, with a narrative. You can give people different roles and you can really give them an insight into how a decision they make will affect something. So again, problem solving. So that's really good fun. And that's the other thing, I guess, with these things. They're really good fun to make. You can involve the students in it themselves as well. So they can make it themselves or they can be involved in the creation. And you can just have a bit of enjoyment together whilst retaining the education, which I think is the priority for most people. So that's that one. If you wouldn't mind moving on. So somebody's just asked if I'll repeat the last tool from Microsoft Forms, and it's branching narratives or scenarios. I can send you the information. So escape rooms is the thing that I was asked to speak about. So that is what I will tell you a little bit more about. I promise I won't be much longer. So like I've already mentioned, the best place to start with an escape room is to plan a narrative. It's good to think of it like a story. Think of a start, a middle, and an end. What do you want your learners to achieve by the end of the activity? And you can actually plan it around learning outcomes. So something I've realised fairly recently after doing quite a lot of escape rooms is that you can actually make an escape room using constructive alignment. And that really helps because then the learners know what they're trying to achieve. So in the same vein, the next thing you might look at is passwords and what you want them to work towards. There are some restrictions with tools about how fancy a password can be, and things like case sensitivities. But if you think about the tool you're going to use beforehand, then you already know that up front. So the other thing to think about with escape rooms is to plan the activity. So that's the part that takes the learning objective and leads them to the password or the assessment, essentially. And there's so much scope in here for creativity because you can make a puzzle about anything. I think my advice would be to try and keep it simple in the first instance, because sometimes it can get really overcomplicated and you completely confuse yourself. I think the most effective types of activities like this are the ones that you can explain really simply, and the ones where you make sure that you maintain a clear focus. I have actually written a paper about escape rooms. I've written a blog post as well now that has lots of different resources in it that will help you to build your own if that's something that you're interested in doing. And I've been on a podcast, which is very weird. And I definitely haven't listened back to that because then I'd have to hear my own voice. But there's lots of resources I can share with you if escape rooms are something that you're interested in looking into. If you wouldn't mind moving on. So the next thing to say really is, I guess, there's no limit when it comes to things that are creative or playful or involve games. The only limit is your own creativity and how serious you want to be. For me, like, if I can create something that is inclusive and that my students are enjoying, then I feel like I've succeeded. And that is something that I keep doing. And I know there's a counter argument of, well, if it's not serious, they're not learning. But I think what I've figured out through my research, through doing a master's in digital education and through a lot of experience of actually doing this in practice, you can make learning enjoyable. That is possible. And it's possible that people can retain information because they're enjoying it. And I think sometimes it's really important to remember that and to not worry too much about what other people think, and listen to your students and see what it is that your students like. You might find that some students really dislike this, and I think that's another really important thing, like not to assume that if somebody's a really avid gamer that they'll enjoy doing something like this, because it might be that they won't. But there's nothing stopping you from adding elements of this into your practice, and it can be really simple to do as well. So that's all I've got to say. Open the floor for anybody else to feedback or ask questions or give ideas. Let me know like what you're thinking if you want me to help with anything. By all means, just unmute as well. I can see somebody's got their hand up. Would you like to speak? So probably, well, it was the first one that I ever did. I worked with a human resources lecturer, and they had a real challenge in that class where students wouldn't do group work. They just absolutely refused. And I'd spoken to this lecturer about playfulness and about whether or not that might be something that helped as an induction activity and like an ice-breaking activity. So what we decided to do was they had like an information lecture where they gave them loads of facts and figures about human resources that was something that they could go and learn in their own time. It wasn't necessary for it to be a lecture. So we put those facts and figures into an escape room. We then put the students into groups, and we mixed the groups up so that it was not students that knew each other. And we got them to go and complete the escape room on their own as a group of 5 students. There was actually 150 students in the room, so this was really challenging in terms of like large group teaching. But the students were predominantly Chinese, so we had a few challenges with phones being set up in different ways. But beyond that, we didn't have any other challenges at all. And what I actually did was a little bit sneaky. I embedded a feedback form into the actual OneNote. So the last task they had to do was give feedback on how they'd found this activity. And the reason I'd done that is because this class had been so challenging in the past that I wanted to understand whether this was something that they found useful or whether it was just something that I was thinking might be useful. We got 100% positive feedback off 150 students. Every single one of them filled it in. It's the only time I've ever had every single student fill in a feedback form, and they all scored it 5 stars as well and asked to do more of it. And then for the year that went on, she didn't have any issues with group work, so they were quite happy to move around different groups. I've worked with another academic on creating a formative assessment using this. And then I had a very brave academic who decided that they'd use an escape room as a formative assessment. And then the summative assessment, the students would have to create escape rooms themselves. And him marking it would involve him trying to get through their escape room and assessing how well they'd actually portrayed the different concepts that they were trying to put through. So that went down really well with students as well. They really enjoyed that. And that actually happened just before COVID hit as well. So that had them in a really great position because it was a digital assessment. So there's a couple of examples of it in practice where I've used it. And I am going to go and find my blog now. Does anybody else have questions they'd like to ask?